19 seconds. That was how long the power died across Pier C in the port city of Karza. 19 seconds from the first pulse on the substation to the moment the last rifle was lowered inside Warehouse 18. When the emergency lights came back, 8 armed men were on the concrete. 6 were dead. 2 were bound and hooded beside a stack of fertilizer sacks marked as agricultural cargo and packed instead with military detonators, forged manifests, and ferry timetables. Daniel Mercer was watching from the operations floor of the Continental Intervention Force headquarters, 3 kilometers inland. He was 39, a career intelligence officer, and he believed in overhead coverage, thermal imagery, call chain analysis, and the kind of networked surveillance that allowed a convoy to be tracked across half a country without a single soldier leaving an air-conditioned container. He had spent 11 months in Sahrain and had watched an entire coalition burn fuel, money, and credibility trying to stop a bombing campaign that kept slipping through its fingers. He had not believed that a foreign unit of fewer than 40 operators from a country most coalition officers could not find on a map would change any of it. The men who hit Warehouse 18 belonged to Maritime Action Group 9, a special reconnaissance and direct action unit from the island republic of Vespera. They had arrived in Karza under a cloud of internal skepticism. They had no attack helicopters of their own, no dedicated drone wing, no armored convoy package worth naming, and no appetite for the theatrical footprint that larger powers considered necessary for urban operations. What they did have was speed, local infiltration, and an institutional obsession with ports, smuggling corridors, and the human habits that hide inside them. Warehouse 18 mattered because of what it represented. For 6 months, the insurgent criminal structure known as the Ash Line had used Karza's waterfront to move explosives, kidnappers, ransom couriers, and bomb makers through the city's container yards and canal districts. Coalition analysts understood the network in fragments. They knew which districts were contaminated. They knew roughly which clerics, shipping agents, and militia financiers were aligned. They knew the port was the artery. What they could not do was close a hand around the beating part of it. Every raid came too late. Every detention turned into another empty room. Every technical intercept produced another ghost. Warehouse 18 was the first time the ghost left fingerprints. The Vesperans had not found the building through a satellite sweep or a mass metadata pull. They found it because one of their case officers spent 9 evenings pretending to audit spoiled fish inventory in the customs quarter. Because a dock foreman with 3 deaths and 1 dying son had started talking, and because someone noticed that a forklift driver always changed gloves before entering one particular lane of the warehouse. The raid itself lasted 19 seconds. The consequences of those 19 seconds would unfold over the next 10 weeks and drag half of Karza's shadow economy into the light. The question that spread through the headquarters that night was not whether the operation had succeeded. It plainly had. The question was how a team that small had moved that quickly in a city that had been defeating much larger formations for almost a year. The answer would expose a failure far larger than one bomb network. It would reveal that the coalition had been measuring the war in the wrong units. Karza, in 2014, was the kind of city modern militaries hate. It was too wet, too crowded, too layered, and too alive. The old city clung to the canal mouths in a maze of concrete apartments, machine shops, fuel depots, rope markets, repair docks, and half-legal warehouses whose ownership changed faster than any registry could record. The modern port to the east processed nearly 40% of Sahrain's imported fuel and food. The refinery district to the south lit the night sky with a permanent orange stain. The slum belts between them hid labor gangs by day and armed couriers by night. Nothing in Karza stayed still, except the water.
The coalition had entered Sarin 18 months earlier to stabilize the state after the collapse of President Nabil Haroun's regime and the fragmentation that followed. Instead of a clean transition, the country split into overlapping wars. Tribal militias fought over checkpoints. Former security officers sold their expertise to whoever paid in cash. Islamist factions discovered that one truck bomb at the ferry terminal could do more political work in 10 seconds than a month of propaganda. In Karza, the ash line grew out of that chaos. It was not a pure insurgency and not merely organized crime. It kidnapped contractors, smuggled explosives through cargo streams, extorted shipping firms, and staged spectacular bombings designed to keep the city frightened and the port unstable. By late spring, the coalition had deployed nearly 22,000 personnel into Sarin, supported by maritime patrol aircraft, fixed surveillance aerostats, signals collection nodes, and a logistics machine that could deliver spare rotor blades to the edge of the desert in under 36 hours. On paper, the intervention force looked invincible. In practice, it was fighting a waterfront network that operated on bicycles, skiffs, forged invoices, and handwritten ledgers passed hand to hand through tea stalls and dock cranes. The coalition could see the city, it could not read it. A classified planning paper circulated inside headquarters in June recommended against expanding Vespera's role in Karza. The reasoning was neat and professionally argued. Maritime Action Group 9 was too small to sustain urban tempo. Its intelligence branch was too dependent on human sources. Its operators had years of anti-smuggling and hostage rescue experience, but limited exposure to full-spectrum insurgent warfare in a city of 3 million. Its doctrine favored concealment and targeted disruption over large-area control. The authors of the assessment were not foolish men. They were measuring capability in aircraft hours, convoy strength, armored protection levels, and ISR density. By those measures, the Vesperans looked insufficient. The recommendation was overruled for 2 reasons. The first was political. Vespera had already lost 6 commercial sailors to kidnappings off the Sarini coast and was not interested in funding a war from the margins, while bigger allies failed to secure the port. The second was operational. Vespera's security service had spent 40 decades dismantling maritime trafficking rings in the island chains north of the Gray Sea, networks that mixed separatists, gun runners, customs corruption, and clan loyalties into structures uncomfortably similar to the ash line. Karza had already embarrassed larger powers by the time Maritime Action Group 9 arrived. Their task was not to pacify the city, not to hold neighborhoods, and not to win the war alone. Their task was narrower and therefore more dangerous. They were sent to identify the irreplaceable people inside the ash line and remove them before the network could replace itself. The city that had swallowed brigades was about to be confronted by a force built not to dominate space, but to compress time.
To understand why the Vesperans mattered in Karza, the story has to leave Sarin and go north to the rain-scoured harbors of Vespera. Maritime Action Group 9 had never been a large unit. At full war establishment, it counted 38 operators, 6 signal specialists, 9 intelligence officers, and an analytical cell small enough to fit around one steel table. Its strength was never mass. Its strength was the type of person it selected and the problems that person was trained to solve. The selection course began in the winter marshes near Dalvik Sound, where candidates spent 12 days moving through tidal flats, freezing rain, and industrial waterfronts under strict noise and light discipline. Navigation was done by chart, compass, tide table, and landmark memory. Candidates carried loads between 28 and 34 kilograms, often while chest-deep in harbor water cold enough to numb fine motor control in minutes. They were graded not only on endurance, but on the things conventional military tests often neglect: whether they could sit for 6 hours inside a sewage culvert without fidgeting,
whether they could recall the license plates of trucks after seeing them once through fogged glass, whether they could walk through a fish market, buy tea, notice three men watching the same alley, and leave without betraying that they had noticed at all. Those who passed entered a continuation cycle focused on three skills: covert observation in civilian infrastructure, human source handling in criminalized environments, and short-duration violence under claustrophobic conditions. Their kill house was not modeled on a villa or embassy. It was modeled on a ship interior, a warehouse office, an engine room, and a dockside apartment with walls thin enough to punish every error. They trained around forklifts, cargo nets, refrigeration units, and metal staircases that amplified footsteps. They learned how to identify a smuggler by the way he carried empty paperwork, how to tell whether a shipping container had been opened recently by the pattern of grease on its locking bars, how to map a port district by shift changes rather than by streets. Most of all, they were trained to assume that technology would help but never save them. Vespera could not afford to build its security doctrine around permanent air dominance or limitless strike aviation. Its operators were expected to function when cameras failed, batteries died, radios went intermittent, and the only reliable sensor in the field was a patient human being who knew what normal looked like and could feel when the air had shifted half a degree away from it. Karza rewarded exactly that mindset. The first teams from Maritime Action Group 9 did not begin with raids. They began with notebooks. They rented upper rooms over a chandlery in the customs quarter, set up 2 observation apartments overlooking a canal bridge used by night freight, built a source network among tug crews, welders, and clinic orderlies, and started compiling what the coalition had somehow never possessed: a living human map of the port. Not the official map, the real one. The map that showed who drank with whom, which warehouse clerk suddenly paid off a debt, which imam blessed funerals for men nobody admitted knowing, which loading crews always vanished on Thursdays before dawn. Within 19 days, they had identified 13 recurring ash line couriers, 4 document forgers, 2 bomb facilitators linked to the refinery belt, and 1 shipping broker who moved between the legal and illegal economies with the confidence of a man who believed nobody could follow both. The coalition had spent months trying to smash the network broadside. The Vesperans were beginning to unpick it thread by thread. The turning point came when the Vesperans stopped treating Karza as a battlefield and started treating it as a circulatory system. Once they understood the human flow of the city, the ash line's protections began to weaken. Safe houses were not chosen at random. They clustered near diesel routes, clinic access, and canal exits. Couriers did not move by the shortest route. They moved by the route that passed the fewest unfamiliar eyes. Money did not travel with bomb makers. It traveled with men who looked too old, too tired, or too respectable to search. None of this was visible from altitude. All of it was visible at street level if a team had the patience to remain in place long enough to confirm what was normal. By mid-July, the Vesperans had established what Daniel Mercer later called the human grid. 2 operators might spend 30 hours across 3 days in a shuttered print shop above Dock Lane 6 simply to confirm whether a specific van arrived before or after the change of prayer shifts. A female case officer named Leora Sen ran a clinic receptionist who logged unexplained hand injuries among stevedores and discovered that 1 set of recurring burns lined up perfectly with a covert explosives workshop hidden inside a cold storage annex. A signals pair, working from a maintenance skiff, used short-range interception not to blanket the port, but to confirm identities already developed through observation. The technology did not lead the process, it sharpened it. The first wave of operations was modest and precise. 3 couriers disappeared from their routines in 1 week. A fuel truck carrying disguised blasting compound never reached the warehouse district. A money runner with a photographic memory was lifted from a traffic bottleneck and processed before dawn. Each capture added weight to the map. Each phone produced a cluster of numbers. Each cluster generated surveillance. The cycle accelerated. Coalition officers who had initially dismissed the Vesperans as niche specialists began noticing a pattern. The small unit was producing targetable intelligence faster than the larger fusion cells. Not because it worked harder, though it did, because it was collecting information in the form the city naturally gave up, through trust, routine, fear, vanity, debt, and carelessness. The ash line had evolved to survive drones and delayed raids. It had not evolved to survive a patient opponent inside the port's circulatory bloodstream. By the end of the month, the Vesperans had enough confidence to move against the middle layer of the network. These were the men who mattered operationally: warehouse managers, transport fixers, bomb couriers, the keepers of false manifests, and the logistical broker known inside coalition files as Harun Basri. Basri did not build devices, deliver sermons, or pull triggers. He connected men, trucks, and storage space. Removing him would not destroy the ash line, but it would expose the architecture hidden behind its violence. The operation against Basri was not spectacular. There was no aerial chase, no massed convoy, no daylight firefight. A sanitation truck delayed traffic outside Canal District 4 at 02:13. A motorcycle stalled at the wrong moment in the wrong lane. Two men in dock workers' coveralls crossed behind Basri's sedan as he stepped out to shout at the blockage. 7 seconds later, he was in the back of a service van with a hood over his head and a needle mark in his neck. By morning, 3 storage sites and 1 family apartment were under watch. By evening, the Vesperans knew the ash line had begun shifting senior personnel inland. The network had finally realized it was being read.
The final campaign lasted 72 nights and nearly broke everyone involved. Intelligence derived from Basri and the materials seized in the follow-on searches revealed the core structure of the ash line's Karza apparatus. 11 senior specialists, 27 trusted facilitators, a ring of transport crews, and a loose outer shell of gunmen, debtors, and hired muscle that varied with cash flow. The Vesperans did not chase the whole thing at once. They moved inward with deliberate cruelty, denying the network time to understand which losses were random and which were part of a design. Week 1 took the drivers. Week 2 took the cache custodians and the 2 men who knew how to convert commercial fertilizer shipments into stable bulk charges. Week 3 targeted the document cell and the accountant who moved ransom payments through fuel invoices and shell companies. Week 4 nearly ended the campaign. A source inside the old grain silos reported that the ash line had consolidated its surviving bomb specialists and kidnapping planners in a riverside textile mill north of the refinery belt. Surveillance confirmed unusual generator use, short-duration night traffic, and one of the network's senior couriers entering the compound after curfew. The assault package was assembled in under 2 hours. 4 entry operators, 2 external marksmen, 1 signals pair, 1 blocking vehicle, 1 reserve element. The plan was simple, because complicated plans die in industrial districts at 3 in the morning. The mill was trapped. The lead operator triggered a shaped charge wired into a false inner door less than a meter from the breach point. The blast slammed him across a loom pit and filled the corridor with dust, fabric fibers, and sparks. His visor cracked. 2 fingers on his support hand broke against the frame. The second operator stepped through the debris, cut left, and shot an armed guard before he could drop behind a spindle rack.
The rest of the team kept moving because stopping would have given the defenders the only thing they needed: 10 more seconds. Inside the mill, they found not the entire senior cell, but something worse and more valuable. They found assembly tables, detonator stock, a wall map of ferry routes, and a coded ledger tied to one location the coalition had never seriously investigated: Terminal 4, the civilian passenger pier used by nearly 6,000 commuters every day. The ledger indicated that the Ash Line's surviving leadership was preparing an attack designed not merely to kill, but to collapse confidence in the port permanently. The intended method was brutally efficient: a fuel service truck loaded with a directional charge package timed to detonate beneath the terminal canopy during the pre-dawn boarding crush 2 days later. From that moment, the operation became a race not against one man, but against a clock. The Vesperans split their effort. One surveillance element went to Terminal 4 disguised as electrical contractors. One arrest team moved on the last known transport coordinator. One intelligence cell broke open the coded ledger through a cross-reference of berth assignments, fuel invoices, and prayer schedules. At 01:42 on the 71st night, the transport coordinator was captured on a canal footbridge with a memory card hidden in the heel of his sandal. By 02:18, the Vesperans knew where the truck had been staged. By 03:06, they knew who was escorting it. By 04:11, they knew the final window. The climax did not happen at the terminal. It happened 900 meters west on a service road between abandoned refrigeration sheds, where the truck was intercepted before dawn by 2 unmarked maintenance vehicles and a barrier trailer swung sideways across the lane. The escort team fought for less than 30 seconds. One tried to run and was shot by a marksman from the roofline of a fish meal plant. Another detonator man was pulled alive from the cab with burns across his forearms and enough information in his pockets to identify the final command location of the Ash Line's Karza Emir. The terminal opened 6 hours late that morning. Most commuters never learned how close the city had come to a mass funeral. The last target was found in a villa that did not fit the war. It stood beyond the old botanical gardens on the western edge of Karza, behind a wall painted the color of clean sand, with a tiled courtyard and irrigation pipes still working in a city where entire districts went dry every 3rd day. The man inside had spent 9 months directing bombings from warehouses and slums while sleeping beneath carved cedar. His real name was Sami Karoun. Coalition files had known him only as the Registrar because every operation linked back to his habit of recording deaths, deliveries, and favors with the precision of a civil servant. By the time the Vesperans moved on the villa, the Ash Line was no longer functioning as a coherent network. It was a wounded organism reacting in fragments. Couriers had stopped using established routes. Mid-level men were fleeing north. Payment chains were broken. 2 safe houses had been abandoned with food still on the table. The city could feel the pressure easing without yet understanding why. Car bomb incidents in the port district fell by more than 60% within 3 weeks. Kidnappings of foreign sailors ceased altogether. Insurance rates for vessels entering Karza dropped for the first time in nearly a year. The raid on Karoun's villa lasted longer than the others because success demanded capture, not speed. The outer security men were taken quietly at the irrigation ditch. A maintenance shed concealment point allowed the entry team to wait for an entire patrol cycle before cutting power to the rear wing. Karoun was found alive in a records room behind a false wall, trying to burn the last of his notebooks in a brass wash basin. He failed. The notebooks survived with scorched edges and revealed what no tactical operation had yet proven. The Ash Line had not merely infiltrated the city, It had been financed by 3 businessmen on the Emergency Reconstruction Board and protected by 2 customs officials whose signatures appeared on coalition-cleared cargo. That discovery should have become the triumphant ending. It did not. It became the reason the real ending had to be quieter. Within 48 hours of Karun's capture, senior officials in the intervention force understood that public disclosure would detonate politically inside Sarin's fragile transitional government. The coalition had been trying to keep the state alive. Exposing the extent of elite complicity risked shattering the cabinet, freezing aid, and reopening the very conditions that had made Karza combustible. So the records were sealed. The businessmen were removed through tax investigations and offshore warrant actions that looked boring on paper.
The customs officials died months later in what local newspapers described as unrelated attacks. The public story became a generic announcement about improved port security and enhanced interagency coordination. Maritime Action Group 9 left Karza 6 weeks after the terminal plot was stopped. They departed at night from the auxiliary harbor, loading their equipment under sodium lamps beside refrigerated cargo containers and stacks of rope. No parade marked their exit. No speech explained what they had done. Daniel Mercer watched them go and understood, perhaps for the first time in his career, that the most important operations in modern war do not always produce the largest battles, the highest body counts, or the clearest public victories. Sometimes they produce absence, the bomb that does not explode, the ferry that still sails at dawn, the district that sleeps through the night, because the men who planned its terror have been removed one by one until the machine cannot turn over anymore. Karza survived, though survival was not the same thing as peace. The city remained corrupt, wounded, and politically brittle. But the port stayed open, the ferries kept moving, trade returned by increments so small they looked meaningless until, months later, the market stalls were full again and the night convoys no longer drove without lights. The lesson of Karza was not that a tiny unit could win a war alone. It could not. The lesson was narrower and harder. Large systems believe they dominate because they can see more, spend more, and move more steel. But there are environments where volume becomes friction and technology becomes delay. In those environments, victory belongs to the force that understands people before patterns, routine before spectacle, and timing before weight. The coalition had entered Sarin believing the port was a logistical problem. The Vesperans treated it as a human one. That was why the others kept arriving too late. That was why Maritime Action Group 9 did not. Years later, the official history of the intervention would devote 4 lines to port stabilization in Karza and 1 vague reference to partner nation special reconnaissance support. Buried in an annex, almost invisible, was the only number that mattered. During the 72-night campaign, the Ash Line lost 83 confirmed operatives, 13 specialist facilitators, 4 finance channels, and its entire bombing architecture in the waterfront districts. The city remembered none of the names. It remembered only the result. At Terminal 4, commuters still crossed the same concrete canopy every morning. Most of them never knew that on one August dawn in 2014, they had been saved by a force small enough to disappear into the port that had once hidden their killers. That was the final shape of the story. Not triumph, not myth. Precision, patience, and the kind of professionalism that leaves behind no monument except ordinary life continuing where death had been scheduled.